Have you ever stopped to consider what would happen if a third of your city simply ceased to exist? All of its people, all of its animals, all of the buildings, the trees, the plant life, here in one moment and literally gone the next. At 5 p.m., what can only be described as a night of hell on earth commenced for the people of St. Louis, Missouri, and with daybreak, the true horrors unraveled as the city proceeded to enter a state of shock, confusion, and utter despair. The survivors called it the Great Cyclone. Today it is remembered as the tragic St. Louis tornado of 1896, and the damage it left behind was, and continues to be, uniquely catastrophic. It is somewhat rare for the core of a large city to be directly hit by a tornado, especially a violent long-track tornado. Unfortunately, many tornadoes have hit St. Louis through the decades. In 1871, 1890, 1904, 1927, 1959, making St. Louis proper one of the most tornado-afflicted urban epicenters in the world. And that doesn't even include the greater St. Louis region. But none of these other historical tornadoes would ever touch the devastation that unfolded that day in 1896. The 1896 tornado season was one of the deadliest in United States history. There were at least 40 killer tornadoes between April 11th and November 26th. Much of what was recorded for posterity are the reports of journalists and their photographer counterparts who immortalized this tragedy. Despite taking place over a century earlier, these photos have more in common with modern images of destruction than you might think. Thomas Grzoulis, author of Significant Tornadoes, informs most of what we know today about tornadoes in American history. When asked about this, he plainly stated his belief that the week of May 24th through the 28th was perhaps the most single, violent week of tornadic activity in U.S. history.
A word of commendation should be given to the Reverend Earl Hicks, the astronomer and weather forecaster. The day of the tornado was a perfect spring day. Not a cloud in the sky, and no one would have any idea that a storm condition was approaching. However, the Reverend Hicks saw his barometer start down about 1 o'clock and notified the public school superintendent that a storm was due and advised that children should be sent home. Fortunately, the superintendent was an intelligent man, and the warning was heeded. The children were sent home. This action saved many lives as several schools were demolished. Alan Stevenson, 1931.
In 1896, predictions of thunderstorms were common, and meteorologists had a positive track record of informing the public when possible. Tornado warnings did not yet exist, and thunderstorm warnings worked as long as the public understood and heeded them, but this helped very little in winds that were between 207 and 260 miles per hour. It was also mistakenly thought that the geography of a region played a role in tornado genesis. Many people felt that St. Louis's terrain was not conducive to tornado formation because of the convergence of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers. The day the tornado struck, the weather seemed very pleasant, but as the afternoon hours ticked away, it grew particularly hot and muggy. Generally speaking, most folks didn't have any reason to be concerned that day. However, when the sky started to darken, many did leave their jobs and head home to shelter with their families. The local Weather Bureau Observatory, who was in charge of thunderstorm prediction, observed that around noon the clouds began to change, and by 4:30 the sky had become incredibly dark. The ominous changes, coupled with a barometric pressure drop, alarmed those who knew that this was an indication of something really, really bad unfolding. Historical accounts allege that by 5 p.m., the sky became dark as midnight, and that's when the torrential rain, thunder, and lightning started. The tornado formed and touched down just 6 miles east of the Eads Bridge.
It is not yet possible to state with certainty how many lives were lost. It will never be known how many were injured. Neither will the identity of all the dead ever be established. Even the death of many victims will not be positively assured, as there are bodies hidden in the river and others buried in wreckage. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch, 1896.
When the Eads Bridge opened to the public in 1874, it was literally hailed as being tornado-proof. James Buchanan Eads meant business. His story is interesting enough to make a whole video on, but for our purposes, let's just say the man's work surpassed all expectations. Eads passed away in 1887, so he never knew the truth of his work. While the bridge did suffer serious damage during the tornado, it failed exactly the way it was supposed to, and it's still standing to this day. The tornado's influence on the Mississippi River was powerful, briefly retrograding the river's flow. Assaulted by the strongest winds on Earth, the steamboats, private vessels, and all manner of barges were torn apart and carried by the wind to far-off places, but the Eads Bridge stood firm. Journalists for the national newspapers observed that the boats on the river were blown everywhere like feathers in the wind. It was even reported that in the aftermath, a large wooden plank had been found driven through a wrought iron plate on the bridge itself. The streets were now filled with wreckage and people who seemed lost and confused. Just like the stories of today, the survivors were in shock and unsure what to do. The truth was, there really weren't words for the atrocities they were observing. The names of the dead mounted with each passing hour, and it became clear to the journalists that the exact toll would never truly be known. Destruction knew no boundaries. Rich neighborhoods or poor, industrial or commercial, new, old, the tornado ravaged everything along its path. Near Lafayette and Missouri Avenues, the reporters commented that after the storm had passed, desolation had succeeded elegance.
Scarcely a house or building remained standing, with everything along the river completely swept away. The long, low line of frame houses that stood to the right of the bridge where the bridge trolley met the local streetcars is gone. Not even the wreckage is in sight. The ground is almost swept clean.
The Great Cyclone was believed by many to be the most catastrophic disaster to strike the United States up until 1896. In fact, to this day, it remains the third deadliest tornado in United States history, surpassed only by the Natchez tornado of 1840 and the tri-state tornado that would follow in 1925. The monster bulldozed its way across the river and began traversing the downtown area of St. Louis as it carved a continuous 1-mile-wide path of destruction. If the tornado had a will of its own, it couldn't have chosen a more destructive path. Homes and schools, saloons, factories, mills and churches, parks, railroad yards, and innumerable businesses were gone in less than 25 minutes. In some areas, the foundations were swept completely clean. When it reached the area of the famous Lafayette Park, the barometric pressure instruments recorded an absolutely staggering pressure drop. Needless to say, the park was destroyed, with most of its beloved old trees and fountain features being ripped to shreds. After the lethal winds had passed, stories of absolute bravery arose immediately. Frank Horner was the superintendent of the waterworks. After the wind passed, he observed severe damage to the piping and ran through the streets collecting as many pairs of hands as he could. And with them, improvised plugs, forcing steam through the pipes and sending water flooding into the city. Though it seemed irrational at the time, it saved the entire city from the wild flames that had begun to spread. The first ward, or island, was generally referred to as ruins, with a massive loss of life beneath it. The following statements were given to reporters so that the public might have an indication as to whether or not loved ones were lost or spared, but many of the pictures showed just how indistinguishable one place was from another.
It would be cruel to use the artistic phrase true to life. Rather, they are true to death, for beneath every ruin human lives were snuffed out in a twinkling, and the unfeeling mass of brick, mortar, and broken timbers pinioned scores whose broken and battered limbs struggled to be free.
In all the railroad yards, the cars were overturned, with their buildings wrecked. Furniture and storage businesses had missing roofs, and all the inventory had been stirred and tumbled into an unrecognizable heap. On the corner of 7th and Rutger Street, the lethal damage was absolutely heartbreaking. It was here that a 3-story brick building containing a saloon and a boarding house was obliterated. It was where approximately 20 families resided. The number of lost souls is hard to calculate given that most documentation was lost during the storm, but it is certain that many lives were cut terribly short. The Liggett and Myers Tobacco Factory was a very successful business in this area. It was undergoing a $1.5 million reconstruction at the time that the tornado struck. Many of the men working on it sought the safety of the basement, but in the devastation it was found that the roofing beams had collapsed through all of the floors, killing almost everyone. Nothing could have been done differently, though, as other buildings with similar designs of the era had also collapsed. This type of destruction would eventually lead to totally different building techniques in the mid-20th century. The tornado took on the appearance of a smaller twister. It seemed to narrow and shrink, but in truth it had actually become more lethal. It followed a path well into eastern St. Louis, where it destroyed even more homes and buildings, including the Vandalia Railroad freight yards, killing another 35 people before it finally roped out and disappeared, leaving the city of 500,000 people traumatized and unsure where to begin.
My brother Louis C. Bader was the telegrapher that sent the first message out of St. Louis after the tornado. He and 2 linemen were assigned to drive by wagon as far outside of St. Louis as necessary to tap in on a wire so that it would be possible to get a message out, as all communication was entirely cut off. They drove 22 miles before they could find a clear wire to tap in on and give the rest of this country news of this city. Mrs. S.A. Nesbitt, 1931.
The fact that any communication took place across the city was miraculous. Electrical wires, telephone wires, telegraph wires, and all the infrastructure that held them up were snapped, warped, and stripped. Parts of this infrastructure could be found miles away from ground zero. Yet calls for backup still rang across the city, and people raced from everywhere to rescue and aid the other victims. In an hour, dozens of people arrived with ambulances that were drawn by horses, and of course nurses and doctors to assist in the search and rescue. The Bicycle Corps was responsible for assisting with the recovery of the railroad services, as couriers relayed information everywhere they could. It was these trips that allowed journalists to continue their work as well, despite many of their home offices having been damaged. It was this collaboration that brought the entire Corps of Physicians to the hospital to begin triaging the wounded. The hospital was actually struck by the tornado, and it was miraculous that the 400 patients already housed there somehow avoided being crushed by the roofing that apparently fell through several floors. The area around the hospital was also congested with debris from the tornado, and it was very difficult to access. There was an attempt to properly document each patient as they arrived, but within minutes, the influx of people was so massive that all those trained in medicine were basically running from patient to patient, doing what they could. The suffering was profound, and one witness noted that some came only to die and be sent to the morgue. As the bodies arrived at the morgue, the crowds grew larger and larger and more hostile. Remains of loved ones were being displayed behind a glass partition so they could be identified. For 24 hours, bodies continued to arrive, and the number of mourners increased to the point where authorities struggled to keep the crowd controlled. Wives and husbands came looking for their spouses. Mothers cried uncontrollably for their missing children, but few people could gain access to the glass partition at a time. Just like today, this was perhaps the worst part of the tornado's malevolence. Many of the churches were heavily damaged or destroyed, so giving the dead their proper funeral rites was made all the more challenging. Names of the dead circulated in communities, and various memorials were held annually, well into the 20th century. Eventually, the community found ways to cope and the will to go on. Somehow, the people of St. Louis managed to rebuild in an amazingly short amount of time. And unlike many cities that have been damaged or destroyed by tornadoes since then, the city's population actually grew from 450,000 in 1890 to 575,000 in 1900.
President Cleveland has promised to sign a resolution arranging for the use of Army tents by families who were robbed of their homes by the storm. A fund of $15,000 for the immediate relief of the homeless was raised on the floor of the Merchants Exchange yesterday with scarcely an effort. The sum will be increased to $100,000 if it is found necessary. May 28, 1896. The St. Louis Globe-Democrat.
Although tents might not seem like a big offering, it's important to remember that this was an era of shifting attitudes about government's responsibility. The devastation on the ground was evident immediately. Families were in crisis and suddenly homeless due to block after block of destruction. Calls for temporary shelter reached the White House the very next day. No disaster preparedness program, no FEMA. The Red Cross had only just been formed in 1881, so aid came from the time-tested methods: public awareness, charity, and volunteer labor from the surrounding areas. Observing the growing panic and chaos breaking out across the city, the governor enlisted the help of the militia as well as 150 extra men who were sworn in as temporary policemen for 30 days to maintain order and prevent looting. Enough damage was done to the city that many people believed it might not be able to host the Republican National Convention coming the following month, which was an important source of revenue citywide. Against enormous odds, everyone was able to work together to make the convention happen. This chain of events really impacted the 1897 city elections, where middle-class candidates were easily defeated. The working-class German voters who lived in neighborhoods most heavily impacted by the tornado changed the political landscape altogether. As is often observed, the best of humanity came to help. When volunteers from surrounding areas arrived, they were able to dig through massive amounts of debris for the injured and deceased, setting up makeshift hospitals and handing out necessities and food to those affected, and generally giving aid wherever they could. City Hospital was rebuilt and reopened in 1907 and went on to serve the public until 1985. In the days following the disaster, communication was restored and the rest of the country learned the gory details of the devastation. Financial aid came to the affected people from everywhere across the United States. Within a few weeks, the city was able to begin the rebuilding process and initiate what is debatably the greatest comeback in tornado history. 8 years later, the once again bustling city of St. Louis, Missouri hosted the 1904 World's Fair, which at that time was the greatest undertaking and global honor the world had to offer. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition, commonly known as the St. Louis World's Fair, was a massive event. The fair was originally planned to coincide with the centennial of the Louisiana Purchase in 1903, but instead it was delayed to be held in conjunction with the 1904 Summer Olympics, which were moved from Chicago to St. Louis. The St. Louis Art Museum originally was the Palace of the Fine Arts, and it was constructed for the fair and is one of the only remaining structures from that event. Brookings Hall at Washington University was also a part of the fair. The Avery and the Forest Park, which was part of the fairgrounds, later became the foundation for the St. Louis Zoo, one of the most revered zoos in the U.S. The fair had a significant impact on the city of St. Louis and solidified its place among the most respected cities in the world. The damage estimates from the tornado put the cost at around $22 million or $700 million in today's dollar value. The official statistics state that 255 people were killed and at least 1,000 were injured, but in truth, these figures are probably too low. No one can be sure how many people drowned in the riverboats, how many people died of infections later, or how many tourists remained unaccounted for, how many bodies were lost to extreme building destruction, and/or the great fires that ensued. The tornado was retroactively rated an F4 on the Fujita scale by Thomas Grzulis himself. The Great St. Louis Cyclone of 1896 was perhaps one of the best documented tornadoes in early American history. This event was one of America's earliest run-ins with disaster tourism. It's impossible to know how many people flocked to St. Louis in the days and weeks after the disaster, but it undoubtedly played a massive role in the city's resurgence and how the Great Cyclone would be remembered forever. Just like you, Americans have always had an interest in tornadoes. This channel will be posting many more videos about American tornado history, so please like and subscribe. And if you'd like to be a part of a growing community, please visit historicastorms.com. Historicastorms.com has all kinds of fun interactive history, resources, and you can join our monthly tornado newsletter. For a few dollars, you can join the tribe at Patreon and have access to early content, future live streams, and our members-only Discord, plus cool merch in the future. Thank you so very much for watching. Y'all be safe, be kind, and remember, you don't have to ride out the storm alone.